Okay, so we're so happy and so proud and honored to have our next guest be with us here today. Among other positions, he is a co-chair of the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign. He works closely with Climate Reality. He is an activist, and we're happy to have him. William Barber III.
Virginia, y'all make some noise. If you ain't tired, make some noise. If we're gonna beat this pipeline, make some noise. As was said, my name is William Barber III. I'm from North Carolina. Glad to be here standing in arms with you all. I represent both the Climate Reality Project and the New Poor People's Campaign. And what we're doing here today is incredibly important, not only for the local community here, but for this nation and for across this globe. This struggle is going to have global significance. So I just want to talk a little bit about that. I won't be before you too long. My friend, the timekeeper, I got it honest, so bear with me. In 1968, Dr. King, in true prophetic form, declared that we have in our lifetime an opportunity to avoid a natural disaster of grand design and create a new spirit of economic and social harmony. An opportunity to write a luminous moral chapter in American history if we only choose. He qualified this, however, saying that though time still permitted us to act and meet the future with a clear conscience, that all of us were on trial in this troubled hour, and that we did not have a millennium to make changes, nor have we a choice of continuing in the old way. That was in 1968. 51 years ago, when the drum major spoke these words, only 5 years after which he had first described a fierce urgency of now, wherein he declared that we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. That in this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late, and that this is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action. 51 years later, in this, the year 2019, we find ourselves in our own fierce urgency of now, a moment where we are called to understand and to understand fully the consequences of our actions. We are living in a moment of three intersecting crises: the crisis of climate, the crisis of our democracy, and the crisis of poverty. On the crisis of climate, the UN IPCC report has listed a window of 12 years, 12, for us to undertake sweeping policy in order to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And that's only with the goal of limiting the effects of climate change to the current devastation with which we are rapidly becoming familiar. Is Virginia in the South? Is Virginia in the South? Right here in the southern United States, southern temperatures have warmed by as much as 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit, with increases in the number of days a year classified as dangerous or extremely dangerous based on National Weather Service heat index guidelines going up. Has it been hot lately? Right here in Virginia, dangerous heat days are expected to quadruple from the current average of less than 10 to more than 40 dangerous heat days a year, threatening 160,000 Virginians who are especially vulnerable to extreme heat. In the South, annual rainfall has decreased across the region, threatening agricultural yields and putting at risk a major component of southern state economies and food security for millions. At the same time that we have lower annual rainfall for the year, we see the increase of more singular extreme rainfall events, rain bombs, which threaten an increase in flood frequency. Since 1958 in the Southeast, there's been an increase of 27% of the amount of precipitation falling during heavy downpours. We see sea level rise of as much as 1 to 3 feet in the past 100 years in low-lying areas in the region. In Virginia alone, 260,000 people live in areas subject to an elevated risk of inland flooding. And 164,000 people live in areas at risk for coastal flooding. Now, by 2050, that number will increase by 137,000 people. On the crisis of poverty, right now, 2019, nearly 41 million Americans live below the federal poverty line, with whites making up 42.5% of this population, Latinos making up 27.4%, and black Americans making up 22.7%. Nearly 140 million people are either poor or low income under the alternative supplemental poverty measure. That's a crisis, y'all. Right here in Virginia, 43% of people in Virginia are poor or low income, a total of 3.5 million residents. This includes 51% of children. Children. Housing, higher education, and healthcare costs have increased significantly. Over the past 30 years, rents have gone up faster than income in nearly every urban area in the country. Now, on the crisis of democracy, when we see attacks on voting rights, attempts to gerrymander our electoral districts, the dismantling of separation of powers, and an attempt to submit into American jurisprudence a legacy of corruption and regressive policies through flawed judicial appointments, that's a crisis. Currently, legislative and actions and legal decisions at the federal and state levels have severely restricted the ability of people of color, especially poor black people, Latinx, and Native Americans, to participate in democratic processes. This includes the 2013 Shelby versus Holder Supreme Court case, which gutted the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We talk about the legacy of the Poor People's Campaign and the Civil Rights Movement. They gutted one of the victories of that movement. 23 states have adopted some form of voter suppression law since 2010. And 25 states have preempted cities from passing minimum wage laws, many in response to successful grassroots living wage campaigns. According to the Electoral Integrity Project, partisan redistricting and gerrymandering, not Russian interference, were the greatest threat to fair elections in the United States in 2016. In total, the Brennan Center for Justice has reported that 23 states have adopted various forms of voter suppression laws since 2010, including 13 with more restrictive voter ID laws. Virginia has required a photo ID to vote since 2013, the very year the Supreme Court undermined the elements of the Voting Rights Act. Is that right? All of this was consistent with the 2015 national study that found that states with a high turnout of voters of color in the previous presidential election were on average expected to see more than 3 additional restrictive proposals every 2 years. Now, when we talk about these 3 crises, the crisis of climate, the crisis of poverty, the crisis of democracy, how do these 3 crises inform us of the larger context of why this pipeline is so devastating? Well, let's talk about it a little bit. My sister Corinna already gave us some really powerful figures. Let's talk about it a little more. We talked about the climate crisis and the direct effects that we will experience here in Virginia and the Southeast. We heard natural gas pipelines emit methane, a greenhouse gas that is 80 times more potent than heat-trapping CO2. This in turn exacerbates and speeds up the climate crisis, moving along the impact to the global ecosystem, but especially affecting vulnerable communities to a greater extent. 2 of the consequences we mentioned earlier regarding climate change were increased temperatures and heavy downpours. Well, increased temperatures make air pollution worse. How? Temperature is one of the greatest contributing factors to ground level ozone, the other 2 being air pollution and sunlight. And what else contributes to air pollution and ground level ozone? Anybody know? Compressor stations, like the one proposed in Union Hill, that emit nitrous oxide and increase ground level ozone. The heavy downpours that we discussed bring with them an increased risk of flooding, but also of runoff and sedimentation, impacting our waterways. Another crisis which I failed to mention was that of our natural ecosystem. It's been less than 2 weeks since a UN special report on biodiversity and ecosystems released the stunning figure that because of our actions, I thought we were called to be stewards, y'all, but because of our actions, because of our choice in continuing the old way, now 1 million plant and animal species on our planet are expected to go extinct. On our watch, I see you. That's not in line with our call to be stewards of this earth. It's not in line with, as the Dalai Lama said, the necessity that because we all share this planet Earth, we have to learn to live in harmony and peace with each other and with nature. It's not in line with what Dr. King warned us, that we must all learn to live together as brothers and sisters or perish together as fools. Now on poverty, poor communities and communities of color are disproportionately burdened with the cost of fossil fuel development. In 2016, an executive in the gas industry, he made this on anonymous, y'all, he didn't go on record, but he admitted that it's an industry practice to avoid development in affluent communities where residents have resources to fight back. He admitted that. According to FERC's own limited analysis, more than half of the 105 census tracts in Virginia and North Carolina within 1 mile of the proposed pipeline's route have disproportionately high populations that are either poor or communities of color, including many Native American populations. In my home state of North Carolina, 7 out of the 8 counties along the proposed route have medium household incomes below the statewide median. 7 out of the 8 counties along the proposed route have poverty levels higher than the state average. And 7 out of the 8 counties have populations of color higher than the state average. And that story is not unique. It's the same here in Virginia, in Union Hill. You know, at some point, we really have to ask ourselves, why are rural communities and communities of color have been designated the dumping ground for our nation's pollution? You know, at some point, we have to stop believing the lie that our rural communities are somehow less deserving of protection and that their only value is in how much of our pollution we can pump and spray and leak into these regions. At some point, we have to stop believing the lie of sacrifice zones, this false argument that certain communities must be exploited and disrupted out of a flawed interpretation of utilitarian necessity. Now, finally on democracy. In order to fix the climate crisis, in order to fix the poverty crisis, we're going to need to fix the crisis of our democracy. At the same time that we see regressive attacks on the rights to vote for U.S. citizens, we see attempts to expand the influence of big money and special interests are able to wield over our elections. Did you all know that nationally, the fossil fuel industry has spent over $2 billion on killing climate laws and renewable energy policies? Here in Virginia, Dominion, anybody know Dominion? A $40 billion energy conglomerate has become the state's largest donor to political campaigns. It has spent over $2 million in targeted community lobbying campaigns for its pipeline project and over another $1 million in general lobbying expenses. Am I right? Is that true? Dominion has relied on several surrogates to do its lobbying. A majoring force on its behalf has been the National Association of Manufacturers, which has lobbied for the Atlantic Coast Pipeline since 2015. And in the 2 years from 2013 to 2015 alone, Dominion donated over $70,000 to the National Association of Manufacturers. In a recent quarter, 13 lobbyists from NAM promoted the ACP to the United States Senate, the United States House, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So facing all of this, what can we do? Well, looking back at Dr. King's fierce urgency of now, there is within that call an essential duality which we must accept. Both that we must act with all due quickness, but also with the thoughtfulness and seriousness of purpose appropriate to meaningful action. So in that is our call to understand and to understand fully where we are. Yes, we are facing looming crisis, and yes, the challenges seem hard, but we must not give ourselves up to dismay. No, this is the moment where we must understand that change does not roll in on the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. And so we must straighten our backs and work for freedom. This is the moment where we must understand that freedom is never really won, that you must earn it and win it in every generation. This is the moment where we must acknowledge the words of James Farmer Jr. that if we do not save the environment, if we do not heed the words of our rural communities, if we do not understand the urgency of this moment, that whatever we do in civil rights, whatever we do in voting rights, whatever we do in the crisis of poverty will be of no meaning, because we will have the equality of extinction. And as such, we must continue to organize, strategize, and mobilize. We must continue to agitate, litigate, and complicate as if our world depends on it, because it does. That is our call to answer. Let us answer, Virginia. Let it start here.
Water is life. The pipeline set us up for a fatal catastrophe. We're taken to the streets, begging to stop this, please. Pipeline compared to lifeline, no comparisons indeed. Pipeline compared to lifeline, cause of corporate greed. Water is life.